Greetings, I'm Dr. Bobby Price, your plant-based pharmacist and nutritionist, also author of Education Over Medication. And today I'm going to dive into an interesting topic, considering we've been in a pandemic for over a year and it seems like we're sort of coming to an end of it. A lot of people are asking me the questions around what should I do? Should I get the jab? Should I not get the jab? And so to sort of get some guidance on that subject, what I like to do is first explain what the immune system is, because most people have a very narrow view of what the immune system is. They look at it from like a one-sided coin perspective when there's actually two sides, okay? And it's even more complex than that. And so I'm gonna dive into that first, and then I'm gonna give you sort of a very scientific and very rational approach to deciding as well. One that I use and other people use as well. So let's first start with what is the immune system, what are the two sides and how they're different. Okay, so you got two sides of the immune system. One side is called the adaptive, and most people are familiar with that one because we call the adaptive side the antibody side. So when most people are thinking about immunity and having immunity to a particular virus, they're thinking about getting antibodies. But typically they're thinking about getting antibodies from a jab, okay, an injection, okay? But your body is capable of actually producing its own antibodies without an injection. I mean, when I was a kid, when my cousins had measles or chicken pox, my grandmother would send me in the room during the summers to sleep with my cousins. I'd get measles or chicken pox and voila, I have antibodies, which means I now have immunity to it. And for most people, that's for a lifetime. And that's really important to understand, but we'll get into that in just a second. But the other side of the coin of immunity is going to be our innate system, which is really our natural immunity, okay? And I'll explain why in just a second. But let's first start with the adaptive immune system. Let's explain sort of what are the components and what it is. So when you think about the adaptive immunity, it's like having a memory attack. So it attacks a virus that it's previously been exposed to, and it developed a military strategy when it was initially exposed to this virus, so that in the case that it became exposed to this virus again in the future, it would unravel that military plan, institute it very quickly, okay? And that's very important because when you look at the adaptive immune system, it can take up to 7 to 14 days for you to actually mount an adaptive immune response or antibody response, okay? So think about it. When you get infected with something or come into contact with it, it could take up to 4 days for it actually to infect the body, okay? And then once it infects the body, then it goes into full replicating itself, making the virus, more copies of itself, and as a result, potentially more severe, okay? So the adaptive side of the immune system or antibody side of the immune system can take up to 7 days to 14 days to mount a response. The other thing that's very important is that the adaptive immune system actually fights the virus when it's outside of the cell, okay? And what's important to understand about that, and we'll talk about a little bit more detail in just a second, is the virus wants to get inside the cell. You have to understand that the virus isn't living or dead. It's just a protein. But when it gets inside of the cell, it takes, control over the machinery inside of the cell and starts to replicating itself, okay? So it has to get inside of the cell to be effective, okay? So that's really important. So the antibody side of the immune system actually fights the infection outside of the cell, okay? The other thing that's really important is that your antibodies aren't actually associated with actually reducing the severity of the disease. So, you may have antibodies, but just because you're mounting an antibody response doesn't necessarily mean that the severity of the disease is always less, okay? I've seen people, who, for instance, got the flu. It was really bad. And then they got the flu again, and it was really bad. And so I'll tell you what actually helps in just a second with actually reducing the actual severity of, being potentially reinfected, okay? So those are just a few things about the antibody side of immunity. Now let's talk about the natural immunity side or the T cell immunity side of the equation that many of us aren't talking about. And I feel like it's the conversation that we need to be having, okay? So when you think about the natural side of immunity, the natural immunity side of the equation, this side of the equation actually uses T cells. Now, what's important about T cells go to the thymus with where they are made. They're made in the thymus, okay? And you make all types of T cells. You make, T cells that are CD8s and CD4s. They do different function. So CD4 cells are responsible for being helper cells. They actually will go to B cells and cause them to create antibodies. So to actually create antibodies, we actually use the natural side of immunity. That's why it's so important. Sometimes I've seen people go out and get an antibody test, which I'll talk more about in a second, and they'll notice that they had the virus, but then they go get the test afterward to see if they now have antibodies, and they'll see that they don't have antibodies. Well, if you don't have a strong side of your natural immunity or the T cell immunity, it may not go over there and convince the B cells. The T cells won't go over there and convince the B cells to actually create antibodies. And that's really important to understand. And I'll explain, a few things that affect this natural side of the immunity. Another thing about this natural immunity is this. It actually kills the virus inside the cell, which is really important, okay? Because as I said before, the virus wants to get inside of the cell to take over the machinery, because outside of the cell is just a protein, okay? And it's not living, it's not dead, but once it gets out inside of the cell, it takes control of the cell like taking over the steering wheel of a car, okay? And then it starts to mass produce itself or replicate itself. So the real damage is actually occurring inside of the cell, and this is where your natural immunity actually goes inside of the cell and actually fights, the virus. Another great thing about when you're thinking about how the virus gets identified, okay, is the cell will actually chop up the virus into pieces, because again, the virus is just a protein, okay? And when you chop a protein up into pieces, those pieces of the proteins become known as peptides, okay? The cell would then present those small pieces on the outside of the cell, which allow T cells to identify those pieces and say, hey, that's the SARS-CoV virus inside of that cell. I mean, essentially what the cell is doing is saying, come over here. You need to kill me because he's trying to kill us. Okay? So that's another great thing about the natural immunity side of the equation. The T cells will recognize those peptides on the outside of the cell, identify it, destroy it. Okay? Which is hugely important. Another very important thing about the natural immunity or T cell immunity is that it responds very quickly. Like I was telling you before, adaptive immunity can take up anywhere from 7 days to 14 days, okay, to actually mount a response to create antibodies. Whereas this natural immunity, it actually can mount a response in 1 to 3 hours, okay? So it reacts very quickly. And that's very important when you have a virus that's actually trying to replicate itself in your body and take over all the cells in your body, okay? So hugely, hugely important. The quicker you can mount a response, the more easier it is to actually fight the infection. So that's really, really, really important. And then the other thing is that these T cells that are in natural immunity will actually hang around that infected tissue. I mean, it will hang out there just to see if the virus is going to come back. So, essentially the natural immunity or the T cells are like the super thugs. They just hang out. I wish he would come back. Okay. And the other cool thing when you're looking at the two differences is the adaptive immunity is going to be very specific. So we're hearing a lot about the SARS-CoV having different variants. Okay. It's transforming itself. It's evolving. So when it comes to antibodies are specific. So it may fight this variant, but if there's a new variant that comes, into the body may not mount a response from it on the adaptive side. adaptive side because it doesn't yet have the antibodies. Whereas on the T cell immunity or natural side, it's non-specific. It does not care. It does not care that there's a new variant. It does not care if it's has a red do-rag on or a blue do-rag. It's like, I don't care who you are. So that's why I call the natural immunity like the super thug side of the immune equation, because it's non-specific. It doesn't care. If you're not supposed to be there, it's going to mount a response. And that's so important. The other cool thing about when you think about the natural side of immunity, we have other parts too. Our skin is part of our innate immunity or natural immunity, okay? Because if a virus gets on our skin prevents it from coming in, okay? So that's the side of the protection. Also our gut or our digestive system, because if you eat something that has the virus on it, okay, and it goes down into your stomach, you have stomach acid there, that stomach acid is going to break down and kill that bacteria or virus. That's what stomach acid is there for, all right? Also in our digestive tract, we have good gut bacteria. And that bacteria is responsible for manufacturing and making 80% of our immunity. Okay? So that's also a part of it. And then our nasal passages or our mucous membranes, you know, if we breathe in any kind of infection, those mucous membranes will capture it on the cilia or the mucus, and then it will cause you to sneeze. Okay? And then when you sneeze it out. So that the actual natural side of immunity is much more robust when you compare it to the antibody side of immunity, okay? There's so many different components. Like I said, you have T cells that are CD8, which actually will kill the virus. You have T cells that are CD4, that are helper cells that are responsible for saying, hey, let me create antibodies, okay? And these antibodies will create long-lasting memory. As a matter of fact, when they compare T cell immunity versus B cell immunity, what they're now establishing is that T cell immunity has a much longer lasting immunity when compared to antibody immunity. Okay, and the reason why they were able to sort of establish this is because in 2003, when we had the first SARS-CoV outbreak, okay, many health workers were of course working in the hospital, so they got exposed to it. And so they actually checked the antibodies and checked the natural immunity for these healthcare workers, okay? And now they're able to check these same healthcare workers from 2003, now in 2021, and see that they still have immunity, T cell immunity or natural immunity 18 years later, okay? And again, SARS-CoV-1 is like the sister to the current SARS-CoV that we're going through. So that's really important to understand. That's a huge differentiator. So the other thing is that we have control over our natural immunity, okay? Our ability to build white blood cells, T cells, to make our natural immunity strong is heavily affected by exercise and nutrition, okay? So depending on the level of exercise or activity we have physically, depending on how good our diet is, will directly affect our natural immunity. So we can make a choice to exercise more. We can make a choice to eat better foods, more fruits, more vegetables, more nuts, more seeds, okay? And as a result, improve our natural immunity. And this is hugely important to understand, is because when we think about things that boost our immunity, things like vitamin C, zinc, magnesium, selenium, quercetin, these are the things that fight off infection, that modulate our immune system. Vitamin D, we get all of these things from natural sources, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, and the sunlight. Okay? We don't get them from animal-based products. Nobody thinks I need more zinc, so I'm going to eat meat or dairy. Okay? So the more fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds you eat, the more you're going to effectively enhance your natural immunity. And that's very important. So let's get into like some rationale. Like, how do you navigate this in a very rational way, even through science, as to whether or not you get the jab or not, okay? Like, that's a really great conversation to have. And so I'll give you sort of an idea with me and how I approach it and how have recommended to friends and family. Okay, so in January, when it was made available, I think it was made available in December of 2020 when they first started handing out the jab to people. They were initially handing it out to healthcare workers. Okay, now they came out with the antibody test where you can test yourself to see if you got antibodies um, if you have been exposed to the coronavirus. Okay, now what's really important to understand is that they discovered that between 40 and 50% of people who get SARS-CoV, they're asymptomatic, meaning they have zero symptoms. They don't even know they have it. Okay, so half of the population who got exposed to the SARS-CoV, they were asymptomatic. They had no idea they had it. Okay, now the reason why that becomes important is because for me personally, in November of 2020, there was a week or so where I lost my sense of smell. Okay, and it took me a few days to actually figure that out. So it might have been even longer. But in any case, I lost my sense of smell. So I was thinking to myself, that's weird. Well, maybe I came into contact with COVID. I mean, I have been working out in the gym since May of 2020. And so here we are in, November. I was like, well, maybe I got exposed to Corona. And so as a result, I'm thinking like, here we are, maybe I should, do this antibody test, see if I have antibodies. Well, I do the test and it's about $50. You can go to like LabCorp and get the results. But I did the test and it comes back abnormal, meaning I had antibodies. I was positive for the IgG antibodies. Now, this means that my body mounted an adaptive immune response, created antibodies for it. Okay, which means that now I have essentially a military strategy in the case where I would come into contact with COVID again. And if you look at the rates of reinfection with COVID, it does happen, but it's very low. So that's really important to understand. So it means that if I have antibodies and if I come in contact with again, in most cases, especially for a healthy person who doesn't have any of those comorbid conditions that we know now, if you are have high blood pressure, have had a stroke, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obese, this increases your risk factor for having a severe infection of SARS-CoV. So we know that to be true. Almost 98% of the population who actually were fatal to COVID actually had a chronic condition. Okay, so we know that chronic disease plays a critical role. So, I'm thinking to myself, relatively healthy. I'm not even sure if I had COVID, but I did have that week or so where I wasn't able to smell. So let me get the antibody test, comes back. I do have the IgG antibodies, which means that I probably came into the contact with Corona and then developed the antibodies. So that's one side of the equation. I have the antibodies, okay? And then so now I'm thinking like, well, I eat really well. I exercise at least 4 to 5 days a week. So that's helping me with Tcell immunity. But then out of the blue, I discovered this new test that you can do called T-Detect, that you can actually test your natural immunity or your T-cell immunity. Okay, so this test costs anywhere from $200 to $220. You do the test and it comes back, and guess what? I have a robust natural immunity as well. So I have both sides of the equation. So when the test came back, I think my levels were somewhere in the neighborhood. I can't remember what the levels are. I don't want to put it out there, but what I do remember is that my IgG levels from the antibody test were somewhere in the neighborhood of like 120, which is a pretty strong antibody response. Okay, I had a friend who had a similar antibody test, and it was around about 50. Okay, so it means that I had a very strong response to it, which is probably why I had no symptoms, with the exception of the week or so where I had no ability to smell. I wouldn't say no, it was just reduced. And so do the T-Detect test, comes back, you have T-cell immunity as well, okay? And given the fact that healthcare workers who were exposed to essentially the sister of this SARS-CoV-1, who were exposed to SARS-CoV-1, and they still have immunity, 18 years later, that helped me clearly understand that not only is our immune system capable of fighting, a condition like SARS-CoV, but it's also capable of fighting it for a very long time. In many cases, most scientists are saying that this immunity is lifelong, especially if you maintain a healthy diet and also exercise. So, and that's critically important. And I say that because when you start thinking about the natural immunity side of the equation, when you have robust T cells, they wake up the adaptive immune system or the antibody immune system. Okay. It wakes it up. Okay. So although I explained it in a separate way, they work together. Okay. So as you can see with the example I explained, it shows you how they work individually, but also how they come together and work as well. Okay. But the take home message that I want you guys to really understand about everything I said today is that our immune systems are capable of fighting any infection. Okay. But we have to position ourselves in a way where our immune system is strong enough to do so. Okay. Any chronic condition will cause you to have immune suppression or be immune compromised. And that's really important to understand. So if you have a chronic condition, that is where your focus needs to be, improving your health overall. And as I said before, when you eat a superior diet and you stay active and you don't, get stressed out, you manage your stress properly, and you get sun exposure and you drink water properly. These are things that boost your natural immunity. And your natural immunity, I can assure you, is very strong enough to do so if in case you have been, you don't have any of those preconditions that I described before. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it gives you some clarity on making any decision that you need to make, because you need to make that decision for yourself. Okay. And if you're going to make a decision, you need to make an informed decision. Okay. Don't make a decision based off of what someone told you, and don't make a decision without doing your own research. Do your own research. And that is so monumentally important. Don't make the assumption that science in and of itself is going to protect you at all costs. I mean, if you look at our current healthcare system here in the US, then that should tell you a lot. We spend the most on healthcare of any nation. And if you look at our current health ranking, we're like number 37 worldwide. Okay. We spend 3 times as much on healthcare here in the US as they do in Europe. Okay. And we get less for our dollars that we spend in healthcare as well, because we're not only the sickest nation in the world, we're the most obese. And so when you look at the food industry and what they allow in the food industry, they allow over 10,000 chemicals in our food supply that they don't allow in places like Europe, Japan, and other places. Okay. And so it's really important to understand that, you have to make informed decisions and you have to do your own research. So I hope this video has been helpful and at least giving you the breadcrumbs necessary for you to do your own research. Okay. And that's what's going to be vitally important. You doing your own research, taking these breadcrumbs, and then making an informed decision. If you have enjoyed this content today, please like and subscribe below. That tells me that you want more of this. That tells me that you want to be more informed. And so please put comments below. I love to hear your feedback, and best wishes out there. Stay healthy, stay vibrant, and stay tapped into your health. Make your health a priority and not an option. And until the next time, peace and blessings and Godspeed.